Good morning and welcome to Facebook Live. My name is Amy Wolf. I'm the President and CEO of AgSafe, and it's my pleasure today to welcome you to our session, again focusing on the H2A Guest Worker Visa Program. So we had an opportunity a short time ago to connect with you about the program itself, what is required to be an active participant in the program, and some of the areas where we as an agricultural industry struggle to use the program successfully. Today, I want to take a little bit of time and share with you some best practices and management strategies on how to most effectively work with H2A guest workers. AgSafe has had the opportunity to do some research into the H2A program, including working on developing an H2A cost estimator. That opportunity was made available to us with a grant provided by the Western Extension Risk Management Education Center. And part of that grant included surveying users of the H2A program to find out not only what the costs are, the hard costs, the dollars and the cost associated with people time, but it was also an opportunity for us to have a thoughtful conversation with those individuals about how have they been most successful in leveraging and using the H2A guest worker visa program. And today's time is going to be spent focusing on those tips and suggestions that those individuals recommend that we take into consideration when it comes to successfully navigating this program. And so we're going to take a little bit of time today to talk about not only how we navigate the paperwork and how we navigate the technical aspects of the program, but more importantly, I want to spend some time talking about how do you ensure that those workers are successful once they come to your farm. As always, opportunities like this have been afforded to us as a result of the resources provided through this grant. We also want to make sure that individuals understand that the information that we're providing today is not constituted legal guidance, but again, our best practices and suggestions from individuals within the industry who have successfully used the H2A guest worker visa program for some time. So first I want to talk about the differences that we see and those individuals that have been using the program observe between their domestic workers as well as their guest workers. I want to talk a little bit about cultural sensitivity. Remember the entire premise of the H2A guest worker program is you are bringing foreign nationals into this country for a period of time, specifically to provide you the temporary assistance needed at some point in your agricultural production season. But it does mean that we're working with individuals who come from different places, where there are different cultural norms, different value systems, and definitely different laws. And we want to ensure that all of those bases get covered so as to ensure that those workers have a successful, positive experience, but you do as well. I want to talk a little bit about training, the importance of training, the fact that the program itself has some training requirements of you as the employer, but how do we take those requirements one step further to really ensure that workers are as successful as possible, and that ultimately you create a positive working relationship with individuals. So if moving forward, you once again find yourself without access to sufficient domestic labor, you know that there is a group of solid, thoughtful, and productive foreign workers that you could potentially bring in a following year, a following season to support your farm. And the flip side of that is accountability. How do you ensure that workers are held accountable? Some of that comes down to effective communication, clear expectations, and ensuring that you're both on the same page relative to what you need and what you expect from those individuals to ensure that ultimately you have the support and the assistance that is necessary. So what's the difference between a domestic worker and a guest worker? Well, functionally, a domestic worker is an individual here in the United States. They do not possess a visa, but they are an individual who is legally authorized at the time of hire to work in the United States. So this is an individual that you have not intentionally sought to bring here, but rather an individual who is already within the United States, either as a citizen or as a resident alien. But in either case, it's an individual who has already gone through the process of ensuring their legal right to work in the United States. Guest workers in this context are individuals who are allowed to come into this country for a very specific window of time with the H2A program. It's a maximum of 10 months in a 12-month window. And that individual has a very specific purpose and is connected to your specific farming operation, right? So a domestic worker is someone who, through their own choice, can move between farming operations. They have already undertaken the paperwork, again, necessary to have the legal right to work in this country, either as a citizen or as a resident alien. But all of the effort for their legal right to work here has been taken upon by that individual. With guest workers, you are taking a very active role in ensuring their legal right to work here in this country for the window of time, specifically to assist you in your farming operation under the H2A program. As our previous Facebook Live video discussed, there are other guest worker visa programs that those in the agricultural industry who are on the processing end can avail themselves of. In this instance, the H2A program is specific to on-farm activity and when that commodity is in its original state. And so you're pursuing the use of individuals who are coming into this country for a specific window of time to work on a contracted period connected to on-farm activity. So where do we see some of the greatest challenges with the use of the H2A guest worker visa program? Well, the U.S. Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division is the entity that has oversight of the execution of the program once individuals are in this country. As we've shared previously, there are a number of different federal agencies that are involved in this program. It's one of the problems with the program, and one of the challenges that folks have found in using it over the years is that you start playing a little bit of alphabet soup. But in the case of how the program is successfully navigated once workers are here, the Department of Labor is who has that oversight. And there are two areas that we see the greatest challenge, and this was validated when having conversations with our survey participants. The two greatest challenges are, number one, rejecting U.S. workers. So you got to take a step back and remember the entire premise of this program is that you as an agricultural employer have not been able to find enough domestic workers to fulfill your needs. Typically, these are peak season needs. Harvest is the most common. And so the struggle is that you cannot find enough domestic workers to fill a crew for harvest. And so you're pursuing the opportunity of bringing in foreign workers to satisfy that need. Where the Department of Labor sees that many agricultural employers find themselves in trouble is number one, you have domestic workers who are willing, able, and qualified to do that H2A job. The regulation qualifies those three areas, that you have a domestic worker that is able, willing, and qualified. And what happens is because you've undertaken the process of bringing in foreign workers, you failed to do two things. Number one, you failed to continue to advertise your position being available for up to halfway through the contract period. So the regulations require that you continue to advertise for domestic assistance, for domestic workers, for up to 50% of the length of the contract. So as an example, if you bring guest workers in for an 8-month period, then the regulation would require that you continue to seek domestic workers for the first 4 months and 1 day of those guest workers contract window. And so we see folks failing to continue to advertise. Once their guest workers get here, they stop continuing to make an effort to hire domestic workers. And if you are advertising and a domestic worker becomes available, we see agricultural employers not hiring that U.S. worker. And so the first biggest and greatest challenge you're going to have is that the government very clearly sees that the priority is to ensure that domestic workers have access to jobs. So anytime a domestic worker who is able, willing, and qualified to work isn't given the opportunity, they have every right to file a complaint with the Department of Labor. And ultimately, you're going to find yourselves on the wrong side of that situation. The other area where we see the most common citations, and this is an area that can get a little complicated when you're figuring out how you address this issue, is the preferential treatment of foreign workers. So, as you may or may not know, with the H2A program, you bear significant financial responsibility for these individuals. It's your financial responsibility to ensure their travel and accommodations to and from the embassy or consulate where they're going to have their visa paperwork processed. You then have a financial obligation to provide their travel and accommodations to get from their home country to your farm, as well as the cost of sending them back. Once they're in the United States, you take responsibility for not only their wages and their, and their hard their hard hourly and or piece rate compensation, but you're also responsible for providing them housing. You're responsible for providing them transportation to and from work, as well as reasonable access to transportation when they aren't working. And you have an obligation to either provide 3 nutritious meals on a daily basis or provide them access to free and sanitary and well-maintained kitchen facilities, as well as free laundry facilities. So when you start adding things up, it gets pretty expensive. And it's one of the reasons why we've pursued this grant to work on creating this H2A cost estimator, because there's a lot of costs. And as we've now come to learn, there's hidden costs, things that on the outset you think you understand, but in reality, you don't. And so what happens is you have a foreign worker receiving this very robust employment package, wages, workers' compensation insurance coverage, and then these additional life benefits, right? Because they're uprooting their life to come and work here, and you don't provide corresponding compensation to your domestic workers. And so one of the things that we know has to happen is if you have got a domestic crew and a guest worker crew, right? You got 2 groups of folks who are doing the same work. You need to quantify the total compensation to that guest worker and then ensure your domestic worker is receiving equal, if not better, total compensation. So this is where our H2A cost estimator is going to be very helpful, because the tool includes this total per worker cost, and you can then take that number and look at what's your hourly rate that you're paying, or the equivalent of an hourly rate if you're paying piece rate, but what's the hourly rate equivalency of what you're paying your domestic worker, and how do you need to either increase that hourly compensation so as to ensure they're receiving, like I said, comparable if not better total compensation than the foreign worker. You can also consider providing some of the benefits to your domestic workers that you provide to your guest workers. There's nothing that prevents you from offering housing to your domestic workers. There's nothing that prevents you from making transportation available to your domestic workers. Nothing prevents you from taking the steps to provide the same level of benefits to your domestic workers as is being provided to your foreign workers. The other important differentiation in this area is what the concept is of a corresponding worker, which means that the workers on a domestic crew and the workers that are guest workers are doing identical work. They're doing corresponding work. And one of the ways that you can help mitigate the potential for claims of preferential treatment is that, quite frankly, the guest workers do lesser work. They do the off-shift work. They do the work that is a little less desirable, and your domestic workers do the more preferred work, and this could take the form of the hours that are provided. It can take the form of the overtime if it's applicable in the place that you live. It would certainly need to be reflected in their hourly compensation. So if your domestic workers are working in a commodity that pays a better piece rate or pays a better hourly rate, then all of those would need to, that would need to be reflected and expressed in their actual compensation. But one of the ways you help delineate and help mitigate this from being an issue within your farming operation is, quite frankly, you give the better work to your domestic workers and you give the less quality work to your foreign workers, and that helps prevent any perception that foreign workers are being treated better. couple of other areas that will assist you in this process is, number one, making sure that you have job descriptions in place. Part of how you will defend your decisions around the type of work that individuals are doing is if you have put together a job description outlining what a thinning crew is doing, what a suckering and topping crew is doing, what a harvesting crew is doing. And so it's important that you have written down, because as anyone knows, when it comes to our friends at the Department of Labor, if it isn't written down, it quite frankly doesn't exist. So you need to ensure that you've written down what work is being done by which type of crew. And you also need to ensure that the description of that work matches the paperwork that was submitted to the Department of Labor as part of your H2A application process. Because in your H2A application, you are going to include, on the job order specifically, you are going to include the type of tasks and work that your guest workers will be doing. And if you find yourself with the assertion by a domestic worker that you have given preferential treatment to the foreign workers, you're not only going to need to show what was on your H2A paperwork, but you're also going to need to show what paperwork was given to your domestic workers, explaining to them that this is the task that they're doing and this is the compensation that they'll receive for doing it. As I mentioned before, what we're trying to mitigate is direct corresponding work. You're trying to prevent these two groups from doing the exact same thing. And our goal is that foreign workers are doing the lesser quality work. What's really important in all of this is not just the paperwork side of the equation, but it's also how this actually manifests itself in day-to-day activity. It's very important that your supervisors, your crew leaders, your managers, whatever term you use for the individuals who have day-to-day oversight of the actions of your workers, of your crews, that those men and women very clearly understand the importance of any type of belief or perception that domestic workers have been discriminated against or that foreign workers have received special treatment. So honestly, guys, it requires a conversation. It requires sitting down and talking about the fact that while foreign workers are here to help us fill a very real need, and we know that the lack of access to legal labor in the United States today is one of the greatest risks impacting farmers. It's why so many folks are considering using this program as a means of mitigating their labor-associated risk. But it doesn't mean that it solves all problems and that it doesn't come with its own set of challenges. So making sure that you consider the impact to your domestic workers, and again, that the men and women who are in charge of and responsible for supervising these individuals understand the importance of not being perceived as giving preferential treatment to those foreign-born workers. All right, shifting gears. So the very premise of the H2A guest worker program is that you've got individuals coming into the United States from other countries. The vast majority of workers that come into the United States come from Latin and South America. And so we recognize that you have individuals coming in who more than likely don't speak English or speak very limited English. Many, in particular, individuals that we now see coming from parts of Mexico speak an indigenous language, which means they also, they don't speak English, they don't speak Spanish, they speak a language indigenous of their region. And so it means that we have a responsibility, and it's important to ensure that these are individuals who understand what is expected of them, what is appropriate behavior, and how we need them to know what our laws are relative to working and what our expectations are of, quite frankly, of their behavior, not only when they're on the job, but when they're in their free time and they're engaging within our community. It also means that we need to be mindful of not having our own set of biases specific to these individuals, and in recognizing in how we communicate with these men and women, both verbally as well as our non-verbally, our facial expressions and our body language. What kind of internal communication do we have established within our farming organization and within those businesses that support our farming operation? And it's incredibly important that we mitigate and minimize any ethnocentrism within our organization. And ethnocentrism is this idea that our ethnicity is better than others. The reality is these are men and women who are coming here to work. They're coming to provide for their families. And we are an industry, to be quite frank, desperate for workers who are willing to do the very difficult, laborious tasks that are associated with farming. We're not trying to pretend or kid ourselves. Farming is hard work. It's physically tiring. It's physically taxing. It requires skill and thought. And so as we pursue sources of labor, it's important to recognize that you're bringing in individuals from countries who think very differently about how one another are treated. A good example is in the United States today, we have seen a significant increase in the attention being paid to anti-harassment and discrimination in the workplace. This has been fueled through mainstream media and movements like the Me Too movement. And the fact that you're bringing in men and women from countries who may have different belief systems about how women and men are treated means that you need to have an understanding of the fact that these are folks who might think about how we treat one another differently. It is certainly not our place to tell them that their beliefs are right or wrong, but it is your responsibility as an employer to ensure that these individuals understand what will and won't be acceptable behavior. So one of the things that you need to consider is, before using this program, is how will you actively and effectively communicate? Do you have a member of your farming operation that does speak the language of the individuals that you are recruiting to come and work on your farm? And if you don't, where are you going to access resources, be it through an organization like AgSafe or through other agricultural trade associations, through faith-based organizations within your community? How are you going to ensure that you have access to individuals who can assist you in communicating with workers to, again, ensure that you set appropriate expectations for what is acceptable behavior, to ensure that they have appropriately communicated what it means to do their job safely, and how you'll manage any potential issues that arise? That's an important part of the program and using the program that you need to consider that doesn't necessarily jump out at you when you're reading through all of the applications and paperwork. One of the other important pieces of information that the survey participants, again, we sat down and had conversations with dozens of agricultural operations who currently use the H2A program and said, how have you been successful in using the program? And nearly every single entity said that part of how they've been successful is when an issue arises or when they need workers to behave in a specific way, that they always explain why. You know, lack of language comprehension has nothing to do with an individual's intelligence. And the fact that we have workers who may not speak or understand English doesn't in any way reflect their natural intelligence or their abilities. And so it's important that you not consider just telling them what to do, but giving them an explanation of why you need them to do it. And this is one of the corner tenets of how we teach adults. You know, here at AgSafe, we spend a significant amount of our time providing training and education. And one of the things that we know with fact is that adults learn best when it's given context, when new concepts are given context, and you explain to them, why do you need to care about this? Why is this important to you? And so consider, if you're having challenges or if you're struggling with ensuring that your guest workers understand the specific task, the expected change in behavior, that you've explained to them why. Why does this matter and why should they care? Effective communication takes many forms. It's not just going to be in your day-to-day interaction and your verbal interaction. One of the ways that you can help ensure that you can reaffirm and validate the points that you communicate verbally is with written support and written documents. So what are the posters? In many instances, from a legal compliance perspective, you've got posters that need to be up that speak to worker safety, that speak to anti-harassment and discrimination, that speak to how to mitigate a chemical incident. So making sure that you're providing posters in multiple languages, the languages in which your workers speak. Do you have an employee manual? Do you have an employee handbook, a place where you've documented what your company's policies and procedures are? It doesn't necessarily have to be a big formal, thick binder of a document, but have you written down what you expect in terms of behavior? Do you have a company code of conduct, for example? Is that in a language other than English? And have you made it readily available? Those are also important elements to consider in the lead up to bringing workers here, is your access to these kinds of documents and ensuring that they are in languages that the workers will understand. Do you use a company newsletter? Do you have the opportunity to, again, not only take issues that you've raised in in-person training, but give them as a reminder a written document that they can take and read at their leisure, that they can go back and review multiple times, that speaks to, again, acceptable behavior, as well as opportunities for motivation and encouragement, so these folks continue doing good work during the time that they're with you. A couple of things to keep in mind when you are conducting the training. I know many agricultural employers who use H2A workers leverage video resources, and then they provide that type of training to workers as they're being transported from their home country into the United States, which is a very effective use of travel time. But one of the things that you need to remember is you have to reinforce those messages once they arrive to your farming operation, and you need to give them an opportunity to ask questions. Your legal due diligence is not just that you showed these workers a video. Your legal due diligence is that they understand what they need to do, and they understand what are the associated risks in their job, and they understand how do they go about addressing an issue should they have one. Obviously, making sure that you're using resources that are in the appropriate language. It's a good idea to make sure that you've addressed literacy challenges. Many of the individuals coming in from other countries are not literate. At least not to the extent that a lot of our employment documents require someone to be. And so what steps have you taken to make sure that you've communicated the concept if this is a case when the individual's ability to read extensively is limited? It helps to provide culturally appropriate examples. It helps to relate things back to how they might have done this type of work within their own country. Again, making sure that you explain why these are important issues for individuals to understand. You do need to make sure that you provide job-specific safety training. So for instance, if any of the folks that are coming in are going to be tackling irrigation, if they're going to be operating any kind of agricultural equipment, what specific training have you provided to them relative to those types of jobs? And don't forget that you also have worker protection standard, which is mandatory pesticide safety training that needs to be provided on an annual basis. And depending upon the state in which you're doing business, many states have additional anti-harassment and discrimination training requirements, as well as heat illness prevention training requirements. And we always suggest that you provide first aid CPR training to ensure that workers know what to do in case of some kind of medical emergency. And the more individuals that have access to that information, just the better off the entire crew is going to be in staying safe on the job. Remember that if you're going to provide effective training, it's not just about playing the video, although videos are certainly very helpful, particularly if we're tackling limited literacy issues. But consider other visual aids, including, hands-on demonstrations. It's one of the reasons why I like, once workers arrive at the farming operation, you take a little bit of time right away, give them a physical orientation, walk them around the property, show them the equipment that they're going to be using, and use that as an opportunity to do a little bit of follow-up and affirmation training based on what they saw in videos. Always encourage hands-on activities. So the chance for there to be role playing, the chance for you to simulate a scenario is always a great way for people to learn. And those hands-on activities and those simulations correspond back to why. So it's not just enough to tell, it's not just enough to show, but really playing out in real time the best way to use pieces of equipment, the best way to respond in case of an emergency is going to be the most effective solution, ensuring that people actually understand these really critical lessons. So shifting gears, as with any employee, there's a balance between holding individuals accountable for their actions and for their work, and motivating those individuals to be as productive as possible. Obviously, individuals who sign up to participate in the H2A guest worker program, there's some natural motivation there to begin with. This is an opportunity for them to make good money that they can provide for their families. But it's also important that you have a balance between again, that motivation and potentially needing to have an accountability and a discipline conversation. So before people even get to work, what basic infrastructure have you created? So first of all, do you have a discipline policy in the first place? So it's not arbitrary, and you can ensure that you're consistently applying what individuals are going to be held accountable for. What constitutes a verbal warning, and what kind of behavior constitutes immediate termination? You need to think those things through and consider implementing a progressive discipline model. The most common is a 1, 2, 3, right? So first a verbal, a second opportunity or a second issue arises and it's a written warning. And then the third time the same type of issue happens, then it becomes termination. But before people even are doing this work, you've thought through how you're going to handle discipline. And subsequently, once you've got workers, you've communicated what those discipline policies are. You also need to think about what constitutes success on the job. So you've got that job description and you've included in your paperwork the type of work that individuals are going to be doing. Well, what kind of rating or evaluation system do you have in place that dictates that this is when people are doing good, hard work? Is it a number of units per hour? Is it the quality of the work that's being done? Is it, minimal damage to plants? What constitutes success? Because you have to have a way to benchmark what success looks like. And again, you have to have a way to effectively communicate your performance expectations to these workers. So if success for you is that they're, picking 10 clamshells every 15 minutes, but that they also have no broken leaves, no broken stems, no damage to the plant, then that's something that you need to communicate. Because arbitrarily determining that, this guy over here isn't doing a good job, well, this guy over here has rights, even as a foreign worker. And the Department of Labor will uphold those rights. And part of that conversation will include what expectations did you set for that worker and how did you communicate those expectations? It's always great to consider different types of contests or incentive programs. These can be based on productivity. These can be based on no safety violations or no lost time because of unsafe behavior. But even with the incentive of being in this country and doing work and the opportunity to make money to send back to your family, human nature is such that people need to be continually motivated and see opportunity for how they can grow and how they can continue to be successful. And so performance-based contests, safety-related contests are also really great ideas. And the ultimate tool in the toolbox is obviously the invitation to return at a future time to continue working for your farming operation. And while we highly advise that you don't make promises to any workers at the end of the contract, communicating that they did a good job and should you need assistance moving forward, you would be open to communicating about opportunities in the future. That's the safest way to communicate an invitation to participate on your farm in the program again in the future. But we do not suggest making promises of returning the following season because, quite frankly, from year to year, things change. And this H2A program continues to evolve. And we would hate to see promised employment when you aren't 100% guaranteed that the following year you'll be able to offer it. One of the other things that the users of the program have commented to us in the survey that we did with them is to remember you're bringing individuals into this country and creating for them a second home. While they are certainly not being held and that they have some degrees of mobility in their free time, meaning, if they can buy a car and have access to a vehicle and they have a driver's license in this country, then certainly they're welcome to have that degree of mobility. Ultimately, the vast majority of guest workers who are coming into this country are relying on you as their employer, quite frankly, for not only their job, but their home and their access to mobility as well. And so, it's a very high probability that depending upon the length of your contract in the course of a year, these individuals have spent more time on your farm than they have with their own family. So trying to create an inclusive culture, trying to create an environment that is welcoming, creating an environment that is open to addressing issues or challenges that these individuals might be experiencing. Keep in mind that homesickness is natural, and what kind of infrastructure do you have in place Things like, access to high-speed Wi-Fi internet, so individuals can use their personal cell phones to FaceTime or Skype or use WhatsApp to be able to communicate with their families at home. Recognize that issues do arise, and on occasion there might be the need for someone to go home in the middle of the contract because of illness or because of family emergency. And what systems do you have in place to support workers, and obviously wanting to encourage them in how they care for their families. And then what kind of additional resources do you make available in their living quarters? That include entertainment, sports, other kinds of activities. They're obviously not working all day, every day, and there will be some downtime. And so one of the elements that we include in our H2A cost estimator is an area where folks have acknowledged the additional cost for sporting equipment. A lot of folks set up soccer fields, basketball courts, purchase bicycles, and have other types of sporting equipment available. A couple of the agricultural employers who participated in the estimator have direct TV and have flat screen TVs and access to television entertainment. So understanding that because you are their home for the window that is this contract, that you want productivity, and you want to create an environment of welcoming and inclusiveness, and that there are thoughts and costs that need to be considered to make that happen and to be successful. Another great resource that came up from many of our participants is their access to the National Center for Farm Worker Health. The National Center for Farm Worker Health has a federal migrant health program, and this is a program that provides resources to health centers across the country, ensuring that there's quality health care for farm workers and their families. And to date, the program serves approximately 800,000 farm workers and their families. And so obviously you need to have thought about if an individual gets sick, or if you have a you obviously have the clinic that provides services if you have a work-related illness or injury. But what happens if someone gets, pretty awful food poisoning, or they come down with the flu, or just the things that happen in life? What are your medical resources going to be, and how are you going to ensure that your guest workers have access to quality health care? And so we suggest visiting the National Center for Farm Worker Health. Their website is ncfh.org to find the nearest clinics to you that are connected through this network and have access to not only the medical resources, but again, from a language and a cultural perspective, can be a tremendous resource in ensuring that you get these workers the medical attention and the medical assistance that they need should a personal medical issue arise. And as I've mentioned, AgSafe has created the H2A cost estimator. We encourage you to visit agsafe.org and check out the estimator for yourself. It's a tool that not only provides the basic costs that we know and seem readily apparent when evaluating using the H2A program, but it also gives you some really good baseline conservative cost data around startup costs, ongoing costs, and just again some of those costs that you wouldn't have thought about had you been using if you've never been using the program. So take a look, and by all means download the cost estimator as a tool for your operation. I want to thank you for taking time and participating in today's webinar. If you have any questions about H2A, about worker safety, or any of the issues as it pertains to ensuring your workforce goes home healthy and whole, do not hesitate to reach out to us at 800-498-9735 or send an email to safeinfo@agsafe.org. As always, thank you so much and have a safe day.